Hello everyone, welcome to the latest episode of Free Kiwis. Today we are delighted to welcome Oliver Hartwich, who is the Executive Director of the New Zealand Initiative, which is a think tank based here in Wellington. Now Oliver, you've had quite a long history of various think tanks. Could you perhaps take us through that and what brought you to New Zealand, how you ended up here when you started life in Germany?
Oh, that's going to be a long story. So my academic background is I'm half an economist and half an academic lawyer. So I did a master's in economics and business in Germany, and then I did a law PhD afterwards between Germany and Australia. After that, moved to Britain, worked briefly in the House of Lords, then joined a think tank there, Policy Exchange. That's where I actually met Briar Lipson. And
oh yes, a previous guest on this.
Indeed.
And an erstwhile colleague of yours at the NZI.
Indeed. So I worked for Policy Exchange, which was a conservative think tank quite closely aligned to David Cameron when he was opposition leader. And then after 4.5 years in London, decided to leave again. My wife's Australian. She was quite keen on Berlin. I was rather keen on Sydney. In the end, it became Sydney. So moved back to Sydney, where I spent part of my PhD time and worked for the Centre for Independent Studies, started a weekly column for an online magazine called The Business Spectator. That was a funny story in itself. I wrote one op-ed on the Euro crisis at the time. The editor called me up and said, would you like to write this a little bit more regularly? And then I said, yeah, sure, what do you have in mind? Weekly column for as long as this crisis lasts. Well, I wrote 300 of them until the online magazine ceased to exist. And then out of nowhere came a call from New Zealand when the New Zealand Business Roundtable and the New Zealand Institute merged. They were looking for someone with think tank experience. And they were probably also trying to find someone to moderate that merger of two quite different think tanks. I always joke that I think they were looking for a neutral Swissman. The best they could find was a German in Sydney. And that's when I moved to Wellington in 2012. So I've been here now for 9.5 years. I've become a New Zealand citizen this year, and that's who I am.
Fantastic. Well, it's great to have you on the show. And I believe you were born in East Germany, is that right, as it was then? Or
Nope, I was actually born in West Germany,
I see.
In the Ruhr, in the former home of coal and steel in Germany. So I was born in a city called Gelsenkirchen. It's the home of my favorite football club, Schalke. That's probably the only thing it's really famous for these days, because it's a city and a whole region actually in quite a long decline. Used to be the economic powerhouse of Germany when coal and steel were still viable in Germany, but it's actually gone through a lot of change in the last few decades, and that's where I grew up.
Right, yes. Now, somebody who I believe was born in East Germany is the now ex-Chancellor of Germany.
Actually, that's not true either.
Oh, it's not true?
No, she was born in Hamburg.
Oh, there you go. Why did I think that?
She grew up in
She
East
grew
Germany,
up
right?
in East Germany. She was one of a very few people who actually made the travel in the direction from west to east. I mean, most East Germans try to get out. Her family actually moved from Hamburg to East Germany.
That's an interesting move.
And was it Helmut Kohl sort of spotted her as a talent, right? And the idea was to get someone who was a East German and a Protestant.
Yes, the story of Angela Merkel is complicated. We don't really know too much about her life before the fall of the Berlin Wall. She was a scientist. She was a member of the Communist Party. She actually led the propaganda section of the Free German Youth, so the youth wing of the old Communist Party of East Germany, but she wasn't really politically active. And that changed when the wall came down. She was looking for a place where she could become politically active. She had a look at the Social Democrats, and at a party meeting of the Social Democrats in East Berlin, encountered a woman she knew and didn't like. Apart from that, she didn't like the fact they were all on first-name terms. That was alien to her. And so she went around shopping for other parties. The one thing she knew was she didn't want to join the Christian Democrats. So she found a splinter party, Demokratischer Aufbruch, kind of democratic awakening, you could loosely translate that, and joined that party. The party was at about 0.5% in the polls, something like that. Mm-hmm. And about half a year later, that party was absorbed by the CDU, so suddenly Merkel was part of a party that she didn't really want to join in the first place. However, she rose to the rank of deputy government spokesperson, and that's when she became known, and that's when Helmut Kohl found her. She then got a mandate in the first freely elected Bundestag after unification in 1990, And she was a young talent, she was a woman, she was a Protestant, she was from the East, so she had everything going for her except for any political experience. And anyway, to Helmut Kohl, that's exactly what he was looking for. So she became a minister in his cabinet, a minister without portfolio initially. Then she got the family ministry, then afterwards the environment ministry, and she rose in the ranks of the party. And when the CDU got kicked out of government in 1998, she was Secretary General of her party to party chair Wolfgang Schäuble. Yeah, and when Schäuble then stumbled over a party donations affair, she managed to get rid of Wolfgang Schäuble and Helmut Kohl in one fell swoop and took the leadership of the Christian Democrats. And 5 years later, she was chancellor. That's Angela Merkel's story, basically.
Yeah, and she was chancellor for a very long time, and I guess by political standards, at least a very successful one.
I don't know about the latter. She was chancellor for a very long time. She has now been chancellor for 16 years. There are only a few days left until she will overtake Helmut Kohl as the longest serving chancellor. That will happen in mid-December. But I'm not sure whether she is a successful chancellor. Actually, I think she's probably the worst chancellor that Germany has had after the war.
I'm not really commenting on her quality so much as her longevity and her apparent success at political manoeuvring. But,
yes.
Yeah.
In that sense, she's clearly successful. I mean, she's been there for a long time. Basically, party leader since 2000. She gave that up in 2018, rather, after a series of defeats in state elections. But no, she's been around for a very long time, dominating German politics, dominating her party. But what she's actually done with all of that power, I think she's actually governed for all these years without ever really leading Germany.
Well, why do you say she's been so unsuccessful? Because it strikes me that if we go back to the sort of Gerhard Schröder years or even before that, early 2000s, Germany was a little bit the sick man of Europe again, and the growth was sluggish. And maybe we should credit Gerhard Schröder for putting through some reforms, but after that, certainly in the years of the Greek crisis, Germany was no longer the sick man of Europe. In fact, in some ways, Germany was too strong an economy for the euro and the EU. So surely, at least she didn't destroy that, right?
Well, as you said, it was Gerhard Schröder who did the reforms. I was still in Germany at the time. In 2003, I remember that in the winter of that year, unemployment edged towards 6 million, and 6 million is quite a number for Germany because that was also the same number that actually drove Hitler to power. So when that happened, there was panic in Germany. What are we going to do about it? The Economist called Germany the sick man of Europe, and Gerhard Schröder, to his credit, actually did some tough reforms. So he reformed the labor market, he reformed the welfare state, and unfortunately for Schröder, the fruits of all of these reforms, they were harvested by Angela Merkel. Schröder himself, of course, got kicked out of the chancellery in 2005. He basically split his party into the left party, so a semi-communist or a socialist party, and the Social Democrats, and Merkel took over. But Merkel, she reaped the rewards of all of Schröder's reforms without adding any of her own reforms to that.
And now the SPD looks like it's made a comeback. Maybe we should just back up for a second and talk about the recent German election, because obviously not everyone listening will be up to date with that. So I know you've been writing columns about it in the New Zealand Initiative newsletter and other places. So could you just sort of give us a quick summary of what happened in a very topsy-turvy campaign, right?
Yes. Okay. So after 16 years with Angela Merkel as chancellor, the CDU was not in the best shape because Merkel, as I argued in a number of pieces, has actually emptied her old party of any kind of convictions, of any kind of political principles. Over her time as party leader and as chancellor, she basically held every single position and the opposite of that position. And so the CDU no longer really knew what it stood for. And that's been ongoing really for the last 2 or 3 years at least. And the party then panicked in 2018 and elected a new party chair. That was Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, former state premier of Saarland. And that didn't really work either. And so Kramp-Karrenbauer decided to resign. The party then, just in the year of the election, needed another party chair and selected the North Westphalian state premier, Armin Laschet. North Westphalia is, of course, the most populous German state, about 18 million people, just for context. And the problem actually was that Armin Laschet, despite being the state premier of the largest state, and despite chairing the largest party at the time, he still wasn't the candidate of his grouping because there is still the Bavarian CSU. So the Conservative Party in Germany is split into two parties. There's the CDU, the Christian Democratic Union for basically all of Germany, but then there's also the Christian Social Union, and that's just for the state of Bavaria. And in the past, the parties always had to figure out which of their leaders would lead the joint party grouping into the election. And this time it was really contentious because both really wanted it. It was an ugly contest, and that damaged Armin Laschet before the campaign had even begun. So that was the first problem of the election campaign. The second problem was the Greens then rose after they nominated one of their co-leaders, Annalena Baerbock, to lead the party into the election. She is a young 40-year-old kind of academic lawyer. That's how she presented herself. We should probably talk about that CV a little bit. And the party rose in the opinion polls to just under 30%. And for a while, it looked quite likely that Germany would end up with its first ever Green chancellor. The problem for the Greens was that Annalena Baerbock actually was found to have manipulated her CV a little bit. So maybe she wasn't the great international lawyer that she claimed she was. And then there were some question marks about her PhD project, which she abandoned, but for which she got 40,000 euros as a stipend from the party foundation. Then there were question marks over her CV, whether she really worked in Brussels or whether she actually worked in Berlin for the European Parliament. So there were quite a few dodgy things in her CV. And on top of that, she published a book. And it didn't take long until people found that she had plagiarized basically on every single page. So the Greens then had their own problem. And with the decline of the Greens in the polls, Armin Laschet and the CDU rose again. And it looked as if they could kind of sleepwalk towards an election victory, not having to do too much because the other parties were busy with themselves. And then it started to rain. And then it poured and it flooded the whole region in Armin Laschet's home state. Now, typically, you would say this is gold for any campaigning politician because you put on your wellies and you're the great crisis manager. And Armin Laschet tried that too, and for a while it almost worked. And then the federal president turned up. So the head of state turns up to give a speech, a very solemn speech, as the federal president likes to do these speeches. He's that kind of type of person. The problem was that Armin Laschet was standing in the background and he was caught laughing. Nobody really knew what he was laughing about, but people thought it was disrespectful, both towards the federal president, but also to the victims of the flood, because more than 100 people died. And when cameras spotted Armin Laschet laughing in the background, in the scene of disaster with the federal president speaking in the foreground, people started then having second thoughts. Is this guy really morally fit to be chancellor? And that's when he tanked in the opinion polls. So we had two parties tank. We had the Greens tank, we had the Christian Democrats tank, and the Social Democrats were still standing. And they were actually, for a change, quite united. I mean, you probably have followed German politics enough to know that the Social Democrats are typically fighting each other, not the other parties. In this election campaign, it was different. They actually stood united. All the various wings and factions of the Social Democrats worked together. And Olaf Scholz, not the most charismatic of candidates, he's vice chancellor and minister of finance, rather boring, has been there for a long time, but someone who's always appeared to be a little bit robotic. That was an advantage because at least you knew who he was, and he was a bit boring, but at least he didn't plagiarize in his latest book, and at least he didn't laugh in the face of disaster. So suddenly the Social Democrats came out of 14-15% and shot up to 25% on election night. And this is basically the story of the German election. And now it looks like Germany is edging towards its first federal traffic light coalition. That means a coalition bringing together the Social Democrats, that's the red, the Free Democrats, so kind of a pro-business, semi-classical liberal party, that's the yellow, and then of course the Greens as the remaining traffic light. And that's quite an experiment, never happened before at the federal level. We'll see.
So one of the big two parties, ultimately got the largest share of the vote, I believe, right? But it does seem that there's this trend that the big two parties aren't virtually monopolizing the electorate in a way that they used to. And I've even seen people talk of a so-called Hollandization of German politics. And it's something that hasn't quite happened in New Zealand yet. But do you think this is a trend in Western democracies?
Like it could happen in New Zealand.
It could. The smaller parties coming up.
ACT is now on 16%. There was a poll, I think, this morning that put the Greens on 10%. So that's more than a quarter of
Yeah.
the votes between those two parties, and National's not doing that much better than ACT. So it is an interesting question.
Well, it's probably a function of MMP. So under MMP, practically no vote is lost as long as your party crosses the 5% threshold or wins an electorate in New Zealand or 3 electorates in Germany. And that's roughly what they got. So the German political system used to be a bit more stable. I think that was the time when New Zealand decided to copy MMP when it looked stable. And there were basically 2 big parties, CDU, CSU on the one hand and the Social Democrats on the other, with the Liberals somewhere swinging in the middle and deciding on the election winner, a bit like Winston Peters used to do that here. That's changed. It first changed in the early 1980s. So in the 1983 election, the Greens first entered parliament. So that became another force in German politics and a force to stay. Then after 1990, after unification, the former Communist Party of East Germany, they stayed in the game as well under various names. First they were called the Left Party, or actually first, the Party of Democratic Socialism, then the Left Party. And then the latest party to emerge is, of course, the Alternative für Deutschland, so right-wing populist party nowadays. Didn't start as that. It started more as a party of Eurosceptical economics professors. But as often happens with these young parties, at some stage they radicalize and one wing takes over.
Like UKIP had a phase, didn't it, when it was run by more sort of technocratic Eurosceptics, and then it became more populist over time.
Well, the beginnings of the AfD, I would say, are totally respectable. These were people like Lucke, economics professor from the University of Hamburg, former CDU member, basically starting the party in protest against the European bailouts for Greece and other countries. They were joined by Hans-Olaf Henkel, former president of IBM Germany and president of the Federation of German Industries, Joachim Stabatti, another reputed economist. So these were serious, decent kind of people. What happened is actually that they attracted a following among right-wing populists and sometimes I would say neo-Nazis. And unfortunately what happened to the party is that these more radical elements pushed out the moderate ones, and the party has radicalized itself.
But it didn't fare so well in this recent election.
Well, it remained relatively steady, which borders on a miracle, because the party is so disunited and is in such a sorry state. It is surprising it even managed to stay steady.
Yeah, I see.
And what about the Linkspartei, which, if I've understood correctly, is an heir of the former ruling party of Communist East Germany?
Yeah, that's right. So the Left Party is, on the one hand, as you describe, the heir of the old Socialist Unity Party of East Germany. But it's more than that now, because it has also merged after the Schröder reforms with what was it called? The election alternative for labor and social justice. Wahlalternative Soziale Gerechtigkeit, something like that. And that was the party, a splinter party founded by Oskar Lafontaine. Remember, he was party chair of the Social Democrats and candidate for the chancellorship in 1990. So he's an old Social Democrat who fell out with his party over the Schröder reform, started a splinter party. The splinter party became relatively successful, and then he merged this new splinter party with the old Socialist Unity Party from the East. So that's the Left Party. The Left Party would have been kicked out of parliament had it not been for 3 constituencies that they won in this election, 2 in Berlin and 1, I believe, in Leipzig. So the party was actually saved by that. Otherwise, on 4.9%, they wouldn't be represented. And actually, it's the second time that it's happened to the Left Party. The first time that they managed to get into the Bundestag just based on 1 constituency was in, I believe, 1994.
Okay. So we've now got this coalition, which is fairly motley, to take power in Germany. So do you think that signals a bit of policy paralysis ahead, or how will they negotiate it, would you, in your view?
Not really. Actually, what I think we'll see is a lot of continuity. You could already get a sense of that at the G20 summit over the weekend. So unprecedented, Angela Merkel took her most likely successor, Olaf Scholz, to the G20 summit. And at every meeting that she had with any world leader, there was Olaf Scholz as well. So she used her 15 minutes with Joe Biden to introduce her likely successor, even though he hasn't been elected in parliament. So it still takes a vote of parliament to confirm Olaf Scholz as the next chancellor, and the coalition negotiations aren't over yet. And still Merkel took him along just to symbolize, actually, there's nothing to fear, there's continuity. And in one sense, I would say there is every reason to think that there will be continuity anyway, because the Social Democrats, we shouldn't forget, they governed with Angela Merkel for 12 of Merkel's 16 years, apart from a brief interlude where Merkel went together with the FDP after the 2009 election for 4 years. But apart from that, it was always with the Social Democrats. The role that the CDU used to play in previous arrangements with the Social Democrats is taken over by the FDP. And from everything that we have seen so far in the coalition negotiations, I actually think the FDP is probably doing a better job than the CDU in such talks before, because they seem to be getting a lot of their programmatic identity through, whereas the CDU, it seemed to me in the past, basically gave in to the Social Democrats and gave them anything that they wanted. And so Merkel actually governed nominally as the Christian Democrats, but these were always very social democratic coalitions. So in that sense, maybe we'll just get a continuation, maybe a bit even a modernization of German government. Let's see.
Okay, so maybe this should be the last question on Germany, even though I'm enjoying this very much. So when I was in Germany briefly at the beginning of 2020, COVID was just starting to hit in the West, and it looked like from the statistics coming out of Germany that far fewer people were dying than in comparable European countries. So I wonder if you could just update us on what's happening in Germany with COVID. Is it still the case that it seems to be weathering it well? What are the kinds of policies, and does it look like the policies are going to change going forward?
Okay, maybe start with a personal observation, because I talk to friends and family in Germany regularly. So from everything that I hear, things are getting back to normal. And actually, if you just look at, for example, the matches in the Bundesliga, you've got full stadia once again, whereas previously they played basically in front of empty stadia and just with a few officials present. The Christmas markets are coming back in Germany this year, so they didn't have any festivities for 2 years almost. There was no Oktoberfest, big development in Germany, of course, but now the Christmas markets are coming back. And well, last night I talked to a very good friend of mine in Münster, a law professor, and he has a very long-distance relationship, and his girlfriend's from Peru. Well, she's able to fly into Germany now, being double vaccinated with no quarantine requirements whatsoever. And make it even better for them, they also booked a nice trip over the New Year's Eve break, and they're going down to Barcelona, they told me. And then he's asking, how are things going in New Zealand? And I said, well, it's a bit different here. Anyway, so Germany is going back to normal. At the same time, they call it the incidence, so that's the number of cases per 100,000 is going up again. So the latest was about 150 cases per week per 100,000 for the whole of Germany. And only a couple of weeks ago, it was about 70. So the pandemic, in that sense, isn't over. They don't have the high number of casualties anymore that they had last year, because Germany has comparable vaccination rates to New Zealand these days. But it's not over, but they are learning to live with it, in some cases learning to die with it.
Yes, and I guess an alternative, I mean, I'm sure the vaccine is certainly a great part of the reasons why the casualties are lower. Another, unhappily, might be that those who are most susceptible have already been taken by it. Do you think there's some truth in that as
Absolutely,
well?
because they had a lot of cases, of course, in rest homes last year. Basically the same development that you observed in many other countries around the world. So the most susceptible people to COVID actually suffered the most early on. And they don't have that same phenomenon in the, whatever it is now, third or fourth wave anymore. The other factor in Germany's favor probably has been that they have a very good hospital infrastructure, unlike New Zealand. So in New Zealand we have, I think it is just under 4 ICU beds per 100,000. The equivalent figure for Germany is around 30.
Yes.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask you about that, as a free market economist, because, one story that I heard when I was in Germany from a certain part of the political spectrum in Germany was that this was partly due to the nature of the German health system, which I don't fully understand, but the idea was that a compulsory insurance system can be a bit more responsive and it's a bit more localized than a single payer system such as the UK has. Do you think that's a good idea?
I'm not a health economist, but from what I understand, actually, by comparison, Germany seems to be really well served, at least on the hospital side. And I've had quite a few conversations recently with people engaged in health reform around the world and asked them of their opinion, how countries are positioned. And Germany actually comes out as one of the countries they think is doing relatively well, not just for COVID, but generally with the numbers of beds available in the hospital, treatments available and so on. So I think the crisis is actually demonstrating that that's probably true. That said, there were reports in some German media last week that they are reaching the capacity again in the hospital system. So they are getting nervous over their ICU capacity. Mm-hmm. And again, that makes me nervous here in New Zealand because I know that they have way more than us.
The capacity is far lower here, and we haven't been through a kind of situation where there have been any significant casualties yet. So that, coupled with what I was saying before about the situation in Germany being different because a lot of people had already been taken by COVID if they were vulnerable to it, one might wonder what will happen in New Zealand if, as seems inevitable, we start to open up again soon. On the other side, and I'd be interested in what you think about this. We've now had some 4,000 Delta cases in the current outbreak, and there have been 2 deaths. One 90-year-old woman and another person in their 50s with some other health issues, which suggests that it's not as lethal for some reason in New Zealand as we might have expected.
That wouldn't be my conclusion. I think actually what we're seeing is that unlike European countries last year, where the first wave actually hit the old and frail population and an unvaccinated population as well, what we see here now is that the majority of cases we have are from Maori or Pacifica backgrounds. They are relatively young, they are unvaccinated. And that is sad for them, of course, that they contract the virus. But on the other hand, they are, of course, not as likely to die from this. If you're in your 40s or 30s, or even 20s, I mean, the chances of you dying from COVID are relatively slim. Yeah. Whereas the rest of the population had an offer to get vaccinated early on, even in New Zealand, and so therefore they are protected. So as long as the virus circulates only in circles that are actually relatively young and relatively healthy, I think we might be lucky and the casualty numbers will remain quite low.
And perhaps as well, we might expect that because we've got to a pretty high level of vaccination before the disease has really taken off, that it might circulate more slowly and it might not be as dangerous even to those who would normally be vulnerable to it.
Indeed. On top of that, of course, we had the lockdown, at least for Auckland. So that's further reducing the numbers. Otherwise, I think it would have probably exploded a bit more already.
Yes. The number of cases would.
Yes.
But the case fatality rate isn't necessarily affected by the total number of cases.
Sure.
Yeah.
Oliver, I hear your concerns about opening up and COVID, and of course it makes sense to be careful. On the other hand, I've also heard you speak in other podcasts from a very sincere and sometimes slightly emotional point of view about the response to COVID and some of the things that have been done, particularly the effective suspension of travel. So what is it that's bothered you about the way that policy has been framed on COVID?
Oh, various things. And you're right to mention that I've been worried by various aspects of it, because I think you can be worried about the effects of opening and at the same time be worried about the effects of locking down. And I'm certainly both. So on the one hand, I think it would have been dangerous to just basically say, let it rip, knowing that we have a hospital system that is simply not prepared for that. And that's one of the failings of our COVID response policy, that we haven't actually anticipated what would happen to our ICU, what would happen to ICU demand. And we're unfortunately not in a position like Australia even, or let alone Germany or Denmark, where you have a really decent hospital infrastructure. So in that sense, I could understand why we would take more drastic measures in other countries simply because we knew we couldn't handle it if it happened. And in fact, I think if we're going back to 2020 and look at what happened in March and April last year, the reason why the government took such extreme measures was, I think, because they knew that our hospital system simply couldn't cope.
Strangely, they don't seem to have spent the intervening 18 months building up the number of ICU beds at all.
Correct, and I think that's one of the
failings. The amount
failings.
of money that they've effectively spent on the lockdowns, right?
$1.5 billion a week on a lockdown. How many ICU beds would that buy?
Well, that's probably not so much the problem. Yes, you could buy beds, but you wouldn't have the ICU nurses.
But they could.
Surely there's a price at which you could attain.
Well, training ICU nurses, from what I'm told, can take up to 5 years.
Sure.
They're really hard to find. They are in global demand, and New Zealand might not be the only country trying to get them at the moment. So I could understand why they were taking extreme measures back then. But then again, I totally agree with you. We should have actually used the last 18 months to figure out what to do about that. So that's one thing that worries me, and that's why I understand that New Zealand has to take some different measures simply because our health system isn't ready, and still isn't ready, even after 1.5 years. But the other thing worries me as well, because I think actually we have seen a dramatic overreach of government in this crisis. And what really frightens me about that is actually that the population just goes along, unthinkingly almost, and lets the government do whatever the government decides it wants to do. And we had opinion polls not so long ago, maybe that's changed now after the outbreak in Auckland, where New Zealanders were asked, so, okay, what are we going to do? When do you want to open the borders again? And a large majority, I think it was about 2/3, said, no, keep the borders closed, basically forever. And that frightened me.
Yes.
And maybe it's because of my own personal background coming from Germany. When I think of closed borders, I think of the Berlin Wall. It's just an association that I can't just shake off. I'm not saying that we're living in an East German style dictatorship, but when people are happy to be locked behind borders, that frightens me. That's not my idea of a democratic, modern country under the rule of law. For me, I actually like this quote by Ralph Dahrendorf, the great sociologist. He said, the world without borders is a desert, but a world with borders that you can't cross is a prison.
Yes.
So I would very much like to have borders, but I would like to be able to cross borders again. And that a large majority of the population here thinks that it's totally fine just to live behind closed borders forever and just lock us away from the rest of the world. That frightens me.
It frightens me too, even though I grew up here. And I wonder, something else that may frighten you, especially given the history of your country, is what happens when a population falls into line too much behind a government and is happy to take its edicts too seriously or without enough questions. And I wonder about our media in that regard as well, because they seem to me to have dropped the ball or derelicted their duty to interrogate the government closely about what it's doing. And it seems to me that is another threat to democracy.
Yeah, totally. Absolutely agree. I think we don't have enough debate in this country anyway, full stop. And the media is not reporting properly, they're not asking the right questions, and the public doesn't demand that either. We had a discussion actually in the office last week on a completely different matter, and we were wondering actually whether with all of these government overreaches, maybe now was the time to introduce a proper written constitution. And, sometimes it takes really bad government to come up with good constitutions. I think that was the case with King John and Magna Carta. Mm-hmm. That was probably the case with the American Constitution.
The American Constitution. Yeah.
It was probably also the case with the Basic Law after the Holocaust. So we said, well, actually, again, not comparing like for like, but this is really bad government doing retrospective legislation, doing all sorts of things that are not quite right. Maybe this would be a time now to actually make sure that politicians behave and play by the rules. The problem I see is actually it takes more than a constitution. It takes a constitutional spirit. And you can have a written constitution and it's not worth much if the people don't demand it being enforced. And that is the thing that really irritates me about New Zealand. I can't find a trace of constitutional spirit in this country. So, give you a few examples. We have a public service which is modeled on the British example. So it should be independent of politics. Well, is that still the case when the Director General of Health attends Cabinet 17 times this year? Or is the public service actually becoming politicized? Different example, we have a reserve bank. The reserve bank is supposedly in charge of price stability, but it's nowadays doing all sorts of other things. It's engaged in indigenous affairs, it's engaged in climate change policy, it takes a position on practically everything. So again, we've got good legislation for the reserve bank, but it's doing whatever it likes. And you could take this to other areas as well. Public finance. I mean, public finance says we should have rules, public finance rules. We should have debt rules. We should have a minister of finance explain how do we get back to manageable debt levels. Well, it doesn't seem to be happening these days either. Nobody's demanding it. And so you look at our constitution as it is on paper, not the constitution, but the way that we have constituted our institutions, but we're not really demanding any of this to be implemented. No. So where is the public outrage? Where is the public demand to actually make sure that we play by the rules?
I'd argue there were even more serious cases recently when rights have been abrogated without much of a hoo-ha. I believe it's the case that early on in the first lockdown, a private citizen actually took the government to court. I can't remember the details of the case, but there was some kind of minor finding that the government acted too quickly in putting through the lockdown.
Yeah, it was the Andrew Geddes case, wasn't it?
Was that right? Okay, and is that correct? They found that basically she was in breach of the law.
Yes. Maybe I'm mistaking. Maybe it wasn't Andrew Geddes. But anyway, I know the case you mean.
Yeah.
What happened was actually it was a Wellington-based lawyer taking the government to court.
That's right.
And the challenge to the government in court was that actually the first 8 days, I believe, of the lockdown were not lawful.
Right.
And the government seemed to implicitly admit that because they changed the foundation of the lockdown, I think, 8 days into that first lockdown, thereby practically admitting, okay, we didn't quite do this right. So the whole thing ended up in court, and the court decided, yeah, okay, well, we can see this was all a bit rushed, but it was unlawful. And yes, it should have been different. Yeah. Two things happened. The Attorney General at the time, and that was David Parker, argued in a long monologue on Facebook, actually, from my perspective, everything was fine. I mean, it doesn't really matter whether David Parker thinks that, it's more like what a court says. But the other thing, which I found even more curious, was that the next day in the staff newspapers, it was reported that the lockdown was pretty legal, quote unquote. And okay, I'm only an academic lawyer, but pretty legal is not a legal term. So from what I read from the judgment, it was unlawful. And unlawful is not the same as pretty legal.
It's like pretty pregnant.
Yeah, exactly. And again, you would kind of think that in a normal democratic country, under the rule of law, if the government is found to have behaved unlawfully, the public would say, well, this is an outrage. How can you? How dare you? Yeah. In Germany, this would fill the newspapers.
Yeah, that's the point. I wasn't necessarily saying, that we can't have a lockdown under any conditions,
of
or
course.
It's never sensible to have a lockdown when there's a new virus circulating or a pandemic. But it is important to act for a government to act within the law, and when it doesn't, I think that's a very serious thing. And as you say, there was mentioned, there was a debate about it at the time, but it pretty much has dropped off the radar completely.
Well, yeah, but take other examples. I mean, we had re-regulations of commercial tenancies just recently. They were introduced overnight under urgency, was brought into Parliament and became law at midnight that same day. There was no consultation, nothing. Landlords and tenants were equally surprised to find that the government had just rearranged their contractual relations. It's an outrage. You can't do it that way. But again,
and yet they did. So
yes.
I mean, like you, I've been wondering about this, and I think part of the problem in New Zealand is that it's not a problem, it's a good thing that may have led to this problem. We've never had a really serious crisis. I mean, we can look at the distant past now when we fought 2 world wars, and so we've been through difficult times for sure. But there's nothing that's ever happened within New Zealand that has caused really serious civil unrest or really there's the waterfront disputes in the 1950s, there was the Springbok Tour in 1981, and those caused substantial unrest, it is true.
After the land wars, you're talking about the 20th
century. I'm talking about 20th century on, not the colonial period per se, when things were less stable for sure. Yeah. But after New Zealand became a nation state independent in 1901, really everything has gone quite stably, all things considered. And so I think New Zealanders are complacent about democracy. I think they're complacent about its underpinnings, and they don't realise that a certain degree of vigilance is required to maintain the institutions that they take all too much for granted. That's my take on it. And I say it with no joy at all. I think it's terrible, but it may be, unfortunately, that a really nasty crisis is going to be necessary to remind people of what's important.
Yeah, I think it's actually worse. New Zealanders think that the state is basically benign. The state is good. The state organizes all sorts of things for us, and the state cannot be evil because it is always meant to bring out the best in us and actually take care of us. Well, if you come from a country where the state has been absolutely evil and where it killed millions of people and where it did all sorts of atrocities, you cannot start from that assumption anymore. And actually, the great thinkers in our classical liberal tradition didn't think that either. And actually, they didn't start from this idea that everything is wonderful and the state can make it a little bit better. I mean, we start from Thomas Hobbes. And Thomas Hobbes was a war of everyone against everybody else. And the state comes in basically in this contractual theory, not so much in Hobbes, but later in John Locke, as the guarantor of liberty. But basically to stop the war of everybody against everybody else, but to give us a framework in which we can be free, but still keeping in mind that the state can be evil, because everybody else can be evil, and something constituted by people can be evil. And so I think classical liberal thinkers in this contractual theory perspective have always known that. And it's been the historical experience and the constitutional experience of various countries to put safeguards in against evil government. And I think that was the response to, after the American Revolution, that was the response in Germany with the Basic Law, but New Zealand never had anything equivalent. In New Zealand, the state was always kind of benign, apart from its dealings perhaps with the Maori. And therefore, many New Zealanders struggle to see that government is something that needs to be kept in check. And coming from this very different background where we had different experience, I struggle to see actually why some things are missing here, some safeguards, like a constitution, like a proper Bill of Rights.
Well, I think, proper Bill of Rights. So I think part of that is that we inherited the British common law approach.
Which is nice.
Which is nice. In fact, one could argue that the British common law system is the best jurisprudence the world has ever invented. But I think as well, it does need to be underpinned by certain values. And in the case of Britain, of course, they went through a millennium of constitutional changes to get to the point where they were a functioning liberal democracy from, a background as an absolute monarchy. And I've often reflected that the sort of slow pace of the evolution of the British system is part of the reason for its great success and stability, that it's actually accreted various mechanisms over a long time that have stood it in good stead. And you could contrast that starkly with, say, Russia, which became the Soviet Union almost overnight and went from being an absolute monarchy to a communist dictatorship. And even after that communist dictatorship fell, they've struggled with stability, and now they've fallen back into a form of tyranny, one could argue. So it seems to me a slow evolution is better than rapid change, or rapid revolutionary change at any rate. But New Zealand has had neither, because it's a very young country and it's inherited a lot from Britain, but it hasn't had enough experience perhaps as a country to understand, or for its populace to really deeply understand what the perils of state overreach might be.
Yeah, and we probably don't even know too much about what happened in other parts of the world because we are mentally quite insular at times. By the way, it is something that you can also see reflected in our attitude towards money and monetary policy. I mean, Germany was a disastrous place for monetary stability from the first half of the 20th century. Hyperinflation in Weimar, another hyperinflation after the Second World War. So Germans had lost their savings twice within 50 years. And they never wanted to experience that again. And so they gave themselves a central bank, the Bundesbank, with the purpose of keeping money stable. And that was the conclusion they're drawn from that history. and the Bundesbank did a splendid job. So I once looked it up for a paper I wrote, and in the 35 years before the introduction of the euro, the other currencies, major currencies in Europe, lost really between 60 and 90% of their value against the mark, because the Germans kept their currency stable come what may. That was why it was so difficult for them to give it up for the euro. But anyway, it was a lesson learned from a really bad past. And that's why they instituted complete political independence. That's why they only gave it one mandate. And Jacques Delors, the former president of the European Commission, once said that not every German believes in God, but they all believe in the Bundesbank. And again, for New Zealand, well, we have a central bank that fortunately has a Reserve Bank Act, which once gave it only price stability as the mandate. We've changed it in the last few years, but you can now see this kind of activism happening because there is simply no history and no institutional background that would anchor it.
Yeah, I think that there's always a danger to bear in mind that the state may become completely tyrannical, but before that, there's also the problem that the state, in enacting its policies, may be quite crude. It may not be completely evil, but it may be quite crude in the way that it goes about using the tools at its disposal. And in the case of COVID, it does strike me that this lockdown rule that's been imposed at various points, perhaps it's necessary, but it's not very sensitive to all the different things that are going on in different people's lives. I mean, I know you're to some extent a follower of Hayek, and I believe it's right that Hayek won the Nobel Prize for his work on the price mechanism, right? And the central insight there was that governments aren't particularly good at gathering all the information in the myriad different contexts that humans are facing in their own lives. And one of the things that I was concerned about during the lockdown was that I knew people in my own family and friends and acquaintances, who would have an individual health problem, or they would have a problem within their family, and they would want to take very sensible measures to deal with these things. Maybe it was just doing more exercise, or going out. In Britain, there was a case of a man who was having an argument with his family, and he went and sat in a car for a bit outside, and the police came along, and he got in trouble for that. So, I mean, as I say, maybe a lockdown rule was necessary, but would you agree that there must be a sort of more intelligent and less authoritarian way of going about this?
Yes, absolutely. As you say, I'm a great fan of Hayek. I actually think he won a Nobel Prize for his business cycle theory in the 1920s, but he later did a lot of work, of course, on dispersed knowledge, starting with Economics and Knowledge in 1937, then the use of knowledge in society, and then I think in 1945 or 6. So yes, we need good rules. We need good rules of just conduct. I mean, that's what Hayek later in his life worked on a lot. Constitution of liberty, law, legislation, liberty. So yes, when it comes to the concrete rules of the lockdown, I agree. They were probably designed too quickly and then not adjusted. And I think what became quite clear towards the end of the first lockdown last year was that the rules were simply not taken into account circumstances enough and different risk profiles. And my favorite example is actually we were supposed to have a repair job on our roof done at the time of the first lockdown, and that couldn't happen because roofers were not allowed to work. And I always thought this is the perfect illustration of why the rules were ridiculous, because what actually happened was the roofer, when he could work then, turned up in the morning, climbed up our roof, changed some screws, painted the roof, and disappeared again, and we hadn't talked to him all day. And he worked on his own. So he could have done this in level 4. It wouldn't have been any risk to anyone. Similarly, I had looked on this year, my WOF expired on my car, and I thought, well, actually, I'm working with a single mechanic, working in a garage on his own. Could have done that. What was the risk? At the same time, in Australia, construction was kept going because they came to a different assessment and thought, well, actually, for businesses can work safely, why not? And I think actually we never had the safety criteria applied to anything we did. We had very strict blanket rules, you can't work, and that was it. And I think actually a more sophisticated regime would have been desirable, but the government simply wasn't so sophisticated enough to design that.
Yes, as you alluded, we might forgive them for not getting it right immediately.
Of course,
there was a crisis. People responded perhaps in a slightly panicked way, and so we had what we had. I would argue that a great deal more thinking ought to have taken place by the time of the second big lockdown that started in about September this year, or August, was it?
August, I think even,
yeah.
yeah.
So it's been going for a while. And, there was a long time to think through these sorts of issues that you're raising and talking about, and also with a cooler head to think perhaps about a cost-benefit analysis.
Yes.
So, and this isn't an easy thing to discuss because we are talking about human lives, but then, it might be a kind of false dichotomy to say that is it the economy or is it lives? Because in the end, money saves lives, doesn't it? We can spend it on the hospital system, we can spend it on life-saving drugs, and one might wonder what would happen if we gave a week's worth of lockdown expense to Pharmac and how many lives they could save with that.
Yeah, and the costs were not just monetary.
Yes, that's my point.
So the costs were also in deferred elective surgery.
Right.
In robbing people of their opportunities, or robbing a young generation of their OE experiences. So there were so many ways in which lockdown actually cost us, not just monetary. Think of mental health.
Yes.
How many, actually I don't have the statistics, but how many suicides happened because of lockdown? How many businesses went under? What stress did it put on families? What about, cruel cases where you can't really measure the damage, but it's incredibly sad. I mean, you probably heard about the case of the guy in MIQ on day 13, 5 tests, all negative, wants to see his dying father. And then they take him out of MIQ, drive him to the rest home where his father is dying, allow him 2 hours, and then drive him back to the MIQ facility only to release him the next morning. How cruel is that? Or what about the prematurely born baby, where the parents did they test positive for COVID? They had contact with a positive case. Well, the baby was born at 7 months, so premature, and now the baby is actually lying there without parents and without touch, and this is just cruel. So not all the costs I think we're talking about are monetary, but there are costs.
Yes.
Yeah, the suicide one I think is a little bit complicated because I think the prediction was made that suicides would rise, and I think the initial figures have suggested that they haven't risen, and in fact they've gone down in New Zealand. But my worry there is that it seems like a lot of the literature on suicides suggests that there's a shadow effect, that when traumatic events or very difficult circumstances occur, you don't get the uptick immediately, but after a while these consequences sort of trickle down into people's lives, and it's at that point that you get a rise. And that's also what worries me more generally, and here you can speak to this because you're an economist. It has to be accepted that I think a lot of the people who are most negative about the lockdowns, they predicted, Damien Grant, for example, springs to mind, they predicted very severe consequences for the economy up front, during the last couple of years, and that hasn't come to pass, right? I mean, it seems like growth within New Zealand has been reasonably healthy. In the UK, they I think estimated something like 5% economic growth. So is this something that's sustainable? Maybe all the free marketers are just wrong about this, and modern monetary theory is right. The government can print money. That's what's been stimulating the economy. So we could just continue having the government supporting the economy in this way.
Yeah, wouldn't that be nice? No, I confess that I was really worried at the beginning of the lockdown last year, and I thought we're falling over a cliff, because I couldn't in my wildest dreams imagine how I could actually tell a whole economy to stay at home without enduring massive consequences. What we've actually seen is we have overcompensated all of that so massively with fiscal policy, with monetary policy. If you look at the figures from last year, they were extraordinary. So Australians, for example, had more net disposable income in their households at the time of the lockdown early last year than they had before, because they were totally overcompensated. We had in both Europe, in Australia and in New Zealand, record low numbers of insolvencies and bankruptcies. So again, showing how much we have compensated for all of these effects. But it's come as a massive cost, and it's a long-term cost, a bit like your mental health cost that you mentioned.
Right.
That will happen later. So first of all, we're dealing with much higher debt levels. We are also dealing with all sorts of other consequences coming out of the monetary stimulus. I mean, think of house prices. House prices in New Zealand are 30% higher than they used to be last year. We have locked a whole generation out of home ownership now because of that. Plus, I think in the long run, what we'll also see is that all of this will come back to haunt us, not least through inflation. So inflation in New Zealand is currently 4.9%. That's consumer price inflation. By the way, as an aside, I'm a little bit skeptical about how we use the term inflation. For me, inflation is always an inflation of the money supply. When people talk about inflation, they mean price rises, but it's not the same. But that's just an aside. Anyway, we have such high price inflation nowadays that at some stage central banks will have to work against it. They will have to increase interest rates. When that happens, and when they do it to the right extent, that they will have to do it, what we'll see is probably that we'll collapse asset markets. So there goes your key receiver balance. There goes the value of your home that you thought had just gone up massively. That goes hand in hand, of course, with increases in unemployment. In some cases in Europe, that might go hand in hand with government defaults. I mean, look at Italy. Italy is at 155% debt to GDP. The Italian government can currently borrow at around 1% for 10-year bonds. Before the GFC, that was closer to 6%. So the moment interest rates normalize, Italy is bankrupt. And with it, the Italian banking system. So the next GFC, if you ask me, is already baked in. That will happen at some stage. It's not a question of if, it's a matter of when. So all of this that helped us get through this crisis much better than anyone anticipated, including myself, but it will come back to haunt us massively.
I guess another consequence of rising interest rates is that people will no longer be able to afford their mortgages. And if you're right and house prices then fall, I'm not quite sure how that works. I mean, I guess it's because demand goes off buying houses. Is it when interest goes up? Is that the mechanism that would cause that collapse?
That is the mechanism. And especially people who only just entered the housing market over the last 12 months will find themselves in negative equity.
Yeah.
So that could be quite unpleasant. So I think actually with everything we are seeing with this massive increase in public and private debt over the last 10, 12 years, I mean, the deleveraging we talked about after the global financial crisis never really happened. We have now created the perfect fertile ground for the next global financial crisis. And we are actually about to release a new report at the initiative where we talk about that. And to me, it's really just a question of when, not of if.
So having got ourselves into this pickle, what would you prescribe as the way ahead if you were made Minister for Finance?
Well, one of the things I would do is I would try to end this extraordinary expensive fiscal policy before the extraordinary monetary circumstances end. So fix the roof while the sun is shining, get your house in order, try to reduce your exposure to debt as much as you can. And that would be my advice to anyone, really, because interest rates will go up at some stage.
To people as well as the country.
Yes. The other thing, and that's probably a little bit more controversial, I think it's time for us as a country to evaluate where we want to keep our reserves. I actually think that it would be wise to have more reserves in gold, maybe in Bitcoin, but not necessarily in US dollars. I think the time of the US dollar will come to an end.
Right. So, I mean, going back to what you were saying about the next global financial crisis being baked in, it's interesting if you look on Our World in Data or any other website like that at GDP in various countries, Western European countries, but also globally. You know, they climb, and then the most serious downturn, of course, in the last few years was the global financial crisis. And people have to bear in mind, as Michael was saying, that it isn't just a question of economy versus health. When you have these downturns, people suffer in various ways. And then things progress again, and then what you see with the COVID crisis or the response that governments have made to COVID is that there's another very distinct downturn, and that's quite striking because you don't see it all that often in the upward trajectory, and so then it brings up the question, you know, all of the problems that are caused by that, not only in the first world, but also in terms of the people on Earth who are most at risk and are suffering the most in general are those in sub-Saharan Africa, the poorest parts of the third world. And there's a decrease in trade with them, and you know they don't develop in a way that they might have. So with all these consequences, you have to start thinking, well, is it, even though COVID is a serious thing, and of course it's much more serious than the annual flu, is this really the right response? And what's a better way of thinking about this than just focusing entirely on COVID to the expense of all other problems that we might have?
Yes, but that's a more general question even than just COVID. I'm not sure whether you're familiar with Björn Lomborg's Copenhagen Consensus.
Yeah.
I mean, that's basically that approach to say, well, actually, Lomborg typically starts from the position of, okay, it's not just climate change, because there's access to clean water, there is malnutrition, there is all sorts of other stuff that is also important. Why do we focus almost exclusively on climate change and nowadays on COVID? And Lomborg, I think, argues this quite convincingly and says, well, actually, if you gave people in sub-Saharan Africa a choice, what problems would you like to have us tackled? Well, then they would probably come to very different answers than the ones that you would get from the media. But I think that's exactly the conversation we need to have. We need to have a cost-benefit analysis and actually just ask, what do you want? Do you want vaccinations? Do you want sanitation projects? Sometimes it's the relatively unspectacular projects where you'll never really manage to get great media headlines out of that are actually having the biggest impact on people's lives.
Mm.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that even within the West, there are exaggerations on the sort of anti-vaccine side, and that people who would have preferred a sort of let it rip approach. There are obvious and sometimes very florid exaggerations on that side, but it also strikes me that because of the media environment we've been living in, there are exaggerations on the other side too. For example, there was a study in August that suggested that the average Briton thinks that around 7% of the British population has died from COVID, and the correct figure is, what is it? Probably something like 0.1%, I believe.
Yep.
Okay, that's actually the mean figure, so it's a little bit of an unfair way of presenting the data, because I think that the median person in that survey guessed about 1% had died of COVID, and then of course, but there was sort of
skewed.
so there were non-trivial numbers of the British public who were guessing that 30 and 40% and 50% of the British population had died of COVID. And the same with infection fatality rates and case fatality rates, which are controversial, and we don't know exactly what they are, and that's a subject for scientific debate. But again, I think in the States, people are there was a study that people suggested that people tended to think that the infection fatality rate was something like 10%. And it's probably below 1%. I mean, it's hard to tell, but it's probably somewhere below 1%.
Mm.
People are generally not very good with probabilities.
No, they're not.
They are also often misinformed on some basic facts of life. Since you mentioned Britain, I worked in Britain on housing policy. One of the things I remember from that time was that there was a survey asking the British how much of their land is covered already by concrete, so by development. The true figure is about 8 to 10%, depending on your definition. But more than 50% of the British believe that more than 50% of their country was concreted over. This is clearly not the reality, but it's probably the reality you perceive living in a British city and never actually seeing the countryside. You only get the real impression when you take a flight into London and you fly over large parts of undeveloped or agriculturally used England. But you would never get that impression, even traveling between London and Oxford. You're basically traveling through suburbs, and it takes a long time until you even get out. So you kind of have this image in your mind that you must be living in the most developed country and concreted over country on earth, and it's simply not true. But that's how our public is misinformed. Actually, it's a matter in so many different areas. I mean, we did a survey with the initiative a couple of years ago asking people about their basic knowledge of political institutions and politics in New Zealand. The answers were astonishing. From memory, I think it was only 5% of New Zealanders who could name the Minister for the Environment. That's David Parker. And only 29% knew that Chris Hipkins was Minister of Education. And the majority of New Zealanders believed that we had a military assistance pact with the UK. Well, somebody should tell the Brits. So we are on so many issues misinformed. And I really wonder how that can play out for politics. Another example, we asked this in February 2020. One of the big debates, of course, of late 2019 was the zero carbon bill. And there was a long discussion in Parliament whether the opposition should go along with that. And in the end, Simon Bridges, as leader, actually made a call, and National supported it. The only party voting against this was ACT. Now, not taken any positions on this particular bill, but we just wanted to know whether people even realize what happened. And 2 months later, I asked them, so which parties voted for it? And only 19% knew that Simon Bridges basically gambled his political career on something that 19% only noticed. So how can you have proper debates on politics, on policy matters, if people don't follow even the most basic things?
Yes, that's a very good question. I mean, one might think of the oil and gas ban in that respect as well, because it seems to me, from what I've read, and you can correct me because I may well be wrong, but it's actually been counterproductive in terms of carbon emissions, because we're going to end up importing coal from places where their techniques are dirty. A similar thing could apply to agricultural cuts that, of course, the world market will make up for any shortfall caused by New Zealand cutting its production, and the overseas practices might actually be more harmful than ours.
Yes, it's actually even worse in climate change policy because of the existence of the emissions trading scheme. I mean, you're probably both aware of how that works, but the average New Zealander isn't. So you can do a lot of nonsense in climate change policy because New Zealanders don't understand how the system works. And so we're getting all sorts of policies that cost enormous amounts of money without cutting carbon emissions by a single gram. So take the fee-based stuff. So now we pay you a subsidy for buying an electric vehicle, and at the same time we're taxing you for importing petrol vehicles. The government claims that one will pay for the other. Actually, the government will collect a lot more money than paying out in electric vehicle subsidies, but anyway, leaving it aside. Even if this policy worked on its own and financed itself, it still wouldn't cut a single gram of carbon dioxide because we've got a cap. We've got a sinking lid through the emissions trading scheme, a cap and trade scheme. And therefore, whatever you save with this kind of policy or any other policy, you will not change New Zealand's total emissions. All you'll do is you'll reduce the certificate price for carbon emissions. So you've got the absurd situation now where, you're paying schools to replace their coal boilers, and the government celebrates itself for the great success in cutting a few tons of carbon dioxide. Well, all it does is it reduces the price of certificates. It doesn't reduce the emissions. So, which is great news for V8 drivers like myself, because I pay less for my petrol. But that's probably not what the government had in mind.
Although I'm not noticing paying less of my petrol at the moment.
Well, that's for different reasons. But seriously, if the government successfully manages to transition some industries to lower emissions technologies, that is good news for motorists driving petrol cars, because they will pay a little bit less for their petrol because the certificate price will go down.
Yes, maybe we should make economics a compulsory subject at school.
Yeah, it depends. It would be nice if people understood a little bit more economics, but then again, you work in education. Can you imagine what happens if you put the government in charge of designing the curriculum?
Well, the government, unfortunately, is in charge of designing the curriculum.
Well, exactly.
And so, yes, I do know the consequences of that, and we can see it in our... this isn't this government in particular, it's every government we've had in the last 30 years or so has failed to address falling literacy. And of course, your erstwhile colleague Breyer wrote a report on that for the New Zealand Initiative, and she exposed some very important problems with the curriculum. It's been captured by certain interests, and the Ministry for Education has been similarly captured, and there's been no Minister for Education with the courage to do much about it, or perhaps the knowledge to do much about it.
So how to change that?
How to change that indeed? Well, we could imagine a scenario that David Seymour and others might recommend to us, where we free up and deregulate the school system somewhat, whereby we can have many different educational institutions, and the government's job is just to fund it, perhaps through vouchers or the like.
But doesn't that come down to the same kind of constitutional spirit debate we had earlier? Where is the demand in the New Zealand population to actually increase the level of education, the quality of education? Where are people in New Zealand fighting for some sort of Humboldtian education ideal? I don't quite see that.
A classics program.
Yeah. Well, okay. Apart from you two, but seriously, what I'm missing is actually a bit more of a thirst for knowledge.
Yes, of course you're right. And again, policy ought to be the servant of values, and it's probably a poor master of values. It probably, I don't think that there are ultimately very good political solutions to these problems if there isn't a kind of a deep understanding amongst the populace of why certain things are important. Then you can have all the policy in the world, but it's not going to fix the problem.
That's exactly right.
I do get a little bit worried, though. I mean, you were talking about the survey you did, and that's quite right. And that, I mean, I trust the methodological quality of your survey, but I mean,
Totally.
It can be paralleled by surveys across the world, and many people will remember the work that Brian Kaplan and others did, the myth of the rational voter, in documenting this effect. But of course, Kaplan and those other libertarian thinkers that I have in mind, they took it in a fairly anti-democratic direction, and they were trying to show that people, the way I interpreted their works, they were trying to show that people couldn't be trusted. And I wouldn't necessarily want to go there, but I mean, it's true that these cognitive biases creep in, and one of them that's very powerful is this availability heuristic. You live in a city, you think, oh, everything's paved over, so Britain must be half paved. Or you watch the news and you think it's all about COVID. COVID must be incredibly dangerous rather than just a little bit dangerous, or it must be the most significant thing rather than a significant thing. And I don't really know how to deal with that in a way that doesn't stray into sort of anti-democratic territory. But I think one important thing that's always gone together in the liberal democratic package has been making sure that you have a basic structure that preserves the freedom of dissidents and the freedom of people with different ideas to have their say and hopefully be respected, if not agreed with, in the public sphere. And I would say if there's anything that really worries me about what's happened with COVID, it's not so much this policy or that policy, it's the fact that, as with a lot of other spheres of public life, it's just felt very difficult even to put the other side of the argument.
Yes, absolutely. And again, it's just a case in point, because we have exactly the same difficulty in climate change policy. The moment you start talking about the ETS and say, actually, let's just do policies that are a little bit more efficient and economically rational, the moment you say that, some people will call you a denier. It's not about denying climate change. It's just saying, okay, you want to cut emissions, and here we are, economists, and we can tell you actually this is how you do it. And the other stuff that you do doesn't make any sense. It makes you feel good and gives you a warm, nice, fuzzy feeling, but it doesn't do anything for emissions. Or take even more complicated matters. I mean, talk about Hepuapur, or talk about three waters. Well, frankly, I think the three waters stuff is mad. The structure is mad to have several layers of appointing an executive of one of these water companies. That in itself is madness, because it just reduces accountability. But start attacking that, because half of that is now elected by iwi. You must be a racist if you attack the structure. And so people actually hold back in their criticism because they don't want to fall into that trap. And I totally get that. So we have now built so many pitfalls in our public discourse that people self-censor all the time.
Yeah.
That's why you're here.
Yeah. And then we'll get hate speech legislation just to make it even better. So.
And I wish we had just an open dialogue on all sorts of things, because that is the idea of democracy, right?
Yeah, that's right.
That's the idea of free Kiwis. And we're coming up to an hour and a quarter, so it's probably a good time to close. But
it's a good idea to close before I say anything that could incriminate me.
Oh, well, this is free Kiwi, so you can say whatever you like here, and
They won't incriminate you
a
until
couple
they
of
pass
hundred
this
people
law,
might
so.
listen. So.
Okay. Good.
But thank you very much, Oliver, for coming along today. And it's been a terrific conversation with you, and covered a lot of ground, from German politics to climate change policy to COVID and all the rest of it. So
Anytime. Thank you
thank
very
you
much
so
for having
much.
me.